really enjoyed studying. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I have. And we are looking at some people that just kind of seem a little insignificant in the Bible. In this lineup of people, you and I could be standing there right with all of them, couldn't we? We're just in the lineup of all the people. But yet, if we really start digging and looking around, we're going to find significant lessons from these seemingly insignificant people. Today, we're going to look at God's three angels, or God's three ministers. They seem very insignificant in the story of King David, and God is going to call them sheltering trees for David at a really dark time in his life. And their names are Shobi, Machir, and Barzillai. How many of you have ever heard of them? I see one, maybe two. Okay, I would join the rest of you. Until I started digging in and really studying, I could not have told you who these three men were. But we're going to examine their lives and see significant lessons we can learn from them. Now, last week, you remember, where did we leave David? We left him kind of hanging on a cliff. And we knew that he has departed from Jerusalem because Absalom is out to kill him. He received the message, go get over the Jordan River because Absalom is on your tail. And so he goes over the Jordan River, and we left it last week. It said David goes to Mahanaim. And Absalom also pitches his tent on the east side of the river. So both camps now are on the east side of the river, and that's where we left them last week. Now, notice our passage today is from 2 Samuel 17, verse 27. And it says, it came to pass now, David comes to Mahanaim. Stop. See, this is how you really start digging in and studying. David has passed through several different places. Why does the Bible tell us now he comes to Mahanaim? Do you think there's something significant about Mahanaim? Ah, there is. So you put on your detective hat and you go digging to find out, why did he tell me they're stopping at Mahanaim? We see the yellow arrow on the map. The yellow arrow is the location of Jerusalem. Do you see the orange arrow? This is where Absalom and all of his men are camped on the east side of the Jordan River. Do you see the green arrow where David is? So David is up at Mahanaim. He's crossed the Jordan River, and he's traveled quite a distance, and he's at Mahanaim, and we're going to find out what's significant there. We have to go back hundreds of years to the book of Genesis, and we're going to chapter 32. We have the story, a continuing story of Esau and of Jacob. And Mahanaim becomes a very important place in the life of Jacob. Now, in verse 1 of chapter 32, it says, now as Jacob went on his way, the angels of God met him. Now, how would you like to be traveling and the angels of God meet you and you can visibly see them? That's what happened to Jacob. And when he saw them, he said, this is God's camp. This is God's host. And he named the place Mahanaim. That's the first mention of Mahanaim in the scripture, so it's very significant. This is where God visibly gave Jacob encouragement, and I am with you, I'm right here with you, and he saw this host of angels. God's angels literally, visibly met Jacob. There's a band of angels. We aren't told how many, but we know he was met with God's angels to encourage him. Now, what is going on? What's significant in the life of Jacob at this time? Is he at a crisis in his life? Wow. He's been living with Uncle Laban for 20 years because he had to leave home because Esau, his brother, wants to kill him. He said, as soon as Dad dies, I'm after you. And so Mother had sent Jacob to live with Uncle Laban up in Padanaram. God comes to him after 20 years, and he says, Jacob, I want you to go home. It is time for you to go home. So Jacob takes his wives, one he wanted, one he didn't. Y'all remember that story? Okay, he's got children, he has servants, he has all of his wealth. Everything Jacob has, he's got with him, and he's headed home. Now, if you see the red arrow at the top of the screen, this is where he has been for 20 years with Uncle Laban, working for him, getting his 2 wives, his family, etc. If you look at the black arrow on the left of the screen, this is Mahanaim. So he has traveled quite a distance before he ever sees the band of God's angels meeting him. You see the blue arrow? This is the land of Esau, Edom. And he is deathly afraid of confronting Esau. He doesn't know what frame of mind Esau is going to be in. But he comes to Mahanaim, he sees this camp of God's angels, and he names it Mahanaim. It means 2 camps. So, what are the 2 camps? Well, here's Jacob's camp. What does he have? I have a bunch of helpless women, I have all these children, and I am scared to death. So that's not much of a camp, is it? And who else does he have? God shows him, you've got a spiritual presence. You've got this bodyguard of angels. I am right here with you for your protection. It's like an impregnable wall of God's angels between Jacob and his band and the foe, the enemy. He still thinks Esau is probably an enemy. He doesn't know what Esau's been thinking for 20 years. Now, he is able to say, the psalmist says this, I being in the way. Was he following the way God had told him? Was he being obedient? Yes, God said it's time for you to go home. He packs up and off he goes. He's headed home. So is he doing what God told him? I being in the way, being obedient for what God has told me to do, what happened? The Lord met me. And that's exactly what happened to him at this time. He's being obedient. And even though there's enemies and foes, he doesn't know what to expect. He said, God met me. Now, does God like to use delays in our life? Many times, we always feel like, I don't know if he's ever going to answer. I don't know if he's ever going to work in this situation. So we feel the delays of God. His timing is not ours, is it? So, but they're really merciful. Now, you can take my experiences. When God was delaying and working in Laura, what was it doing for me? Was it drawing me closer to him? Because I realized how helpless I was. I couldn't change the situation. The more I tried to change her, the more strained was the relationship. And so as I fully realized, and I came to the end of myself, I came to the end of being self-sufficient, I came to the end of being strong and independent, humbled myself and just laid out before him, I give up and I cannot do anything about this situation. It helps us realize our need of him. When he delays and we're not sure, we run to him and we hide for him in our refuge. Now, Tony Evans says, when God delays in your life, he's always looking and working for a greater purpose. Has that not been true in my life? Absolutely. And I would never have dreamed what God has orchestrated after he worked in Laura and what he's doing now in bringing her home and restoring her. So why does God allow the delays? Do you always feel like you're in the waiting room? I feel like I've been in the waiting room a lot. But he's providing room. He's making time. That sorrow that you have in your heart, that grief maybe that's in your heart, the burden that's in your heart, as you draw to him and surrender it to him, what happens to you? The peace. When I just surrender it all to him, I cannot describe for you the peace that came over me even before I knew he was working in her. So he allows delays so we will go to him, our refuge, and then he can just bless us as we submit and yield to him a peace that passes all understanding. Does it ever seem God let you get to the very edge of the precipice and you think you're going to go just crashing and burning? Does he usually save in the nick of time? It's in the nick of time, just like with the children crossing the Red Sea. Remember, he hemmed them in. They couldn't go anywhere. And then he stretches out that strong right arm and he intervenes in the behalf of his people. Think about his delay with Lazarus. You remember the story of Lazarus, Mary and Martha? They sent word to Jesus, you need to come. He's sick. He's going to die. Jesus didn't go. He waited, and what happened? Lazarus died. Were they a little upset? They were a little upset. But God's delay provided a miracle of God's power, because when Jesus got there and 4 days later, after Lazarus had died, he stood at the tomb and he said, Lazarus, come forth. And what happened? He did. And the display of God's power, we never know what God's going to do at the end when he intervenes. We never know how the situation's going to turn out, how he's going to use it for his glory. This is the picture that began to mean a lot to me when I was dealing with the situation with Laura. Rest in the Lord. You just come before him. You can just spill out everything that's troubling you. But when you yield and you keep your sin confessed and you're a clean vessel before him, he promises you that you will have rest. You will have his strength for whatever it is in your life. And you learn to wait patiently, because he did a work in me while we were in the waiting room. He did a work in me. He did a work in the life of my husband. And he was doing a work in the life of Laura. And at his timing, it all came together. And who received the glory for the miracle? God alone. It was him working the whole time. So you and I, we have all the armies of heaven. Just like he sent them to Jacob, you and I have that all the time. When? I am running the path that God has for me. Now, do we all have the same goal? We all have the same prize. We're all going for the same goal, to be transformed into the image of Jesus Christ. But is your path a little different from mine? Yes, we all have a little bit different paths, but we're all seeking to be transformed into the image of Jesus Christ, because that's his will for each and every one of us. Many times we go before him feeling very weak. We're scared, we're frightened, we're trembling. But you commit it to him. You go before him and just tell him your fears and so forth. And you commit yourself to him, and he says, you have all the armies of heaven. When you are walking in the path that I have for you and you're being obedient, just like he was with Jacob, you have all the protection you need and God working in your situation. And you can say with Jacob, I being in the way, the Lord met me. Isn't that an awesome thing? That is such a comfort to those of us as we struggle in our lives. Now let's fast forward. We're going to go many years forward now, and we're past Jacob, but we know what Mahanaim means, and we know where the first mention of it is in the Bible. So now David is coming there, and what do we see with David? We have another trembling fugitive there at Mahanaim. Remember, what did the Bible tell us when David left Jerusalem? He was downcast. He felt humiliated. He was low. He covered his head. He was mourning. He was barefoot. When he left, he's crossed the Kidron Valley, and he has ascended the Mount of Olives, and now he's crossed the Jordan River. He's traveled a distance, and he's taken all of his people, and they are at Mahanaim. He, like Jacob, is fearful of the vengeance of the anger of one that's related by blood. Jacob was scared of what Esau was going to do to him, his brother, and David is fearful of Absalom. His son is out to kill him and murder him and take the throne away from him. David, the psalmist, he said, I looked on my right hand and beheld, there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me, and no one cared for my soul. Now, when poor King David was fleeing from the face of Absalom, his son, the first place where he really stopped and made camp. And he stays there now during the war and during the rebellion was Mahanaim. 2 camps, my camp and God's camp. So this is where we are in the life of David. David, the commentators think, wrote Psalm 3, which we had last week. Remember, thou, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. And then they also think he wrote Psalm 4. And it says, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, for thou, Lord, only make me dwell in safety. In Isaiah, we have a wonderful promise. It says, you will keep him in perfect peace. Is that where a lot of people stop? I've seen people and heard people take that and they say, God promised to keep me in perfect peace. No, you need to read the rest of the verse. Do a lot of our promises have parameters? They do. You will keep him in perfect peace. Who? Whose mind is stayed on thee. That's who the promise is for. Our mind is stayed on him. I'm meditating on the word. I'm in the word, allowing the word to change me, and then I'm promised his perfect peace. So in 2 Samuel 17:27, it says, David comes to Mahanaim. Now, we all know what that means, right? See, so we've had a Bible study about Mahanaim. And this is how you dig in when you see something that looks significant. Research it and go see what that's all about. Now, who's there? Mahanaim. And who do we find? We find Shobi, the son of Nahash of Rabbah of the children of Ammon. Have you ever noticed in the Bible when they name people, they tell you who their father was or maybe where they came from? Do you think it's significant? I do not know what's wrong. Okay. And then Machir, and Machir is the son of Ammiel of Lodabar. And then Barzillai is the Gileadite of Rogelim. Now that sounds like a lot of stuff, doesn't it? You know me. Where are we going? We're going to look at those names and see why God chose these 3. Now here's what they do. These 3 men get together, and we know where David is now. Remember, his people have left Jerusalem very quickly. They don't have hardly anything with them except what they could carry on their backs because they got out of Jerusalem quickly. So these 3 men bring beds, basins, earthen vessels. They bring wheat and barley and flour and parched corn, beans and lentils and parched pulse. They bring honey and butter and sheep and cheese of kine. Who do they bring it for? David and all of his people. Now, why do they bring it? The Bible tells you. Because they saw a need, the people were hungry, the people were weary, and the people were thirsty, and they're out there in the wilderness. So we have God's going to lay it on the heart of these 3 men to come and provide the needs for the people. Remember, David is literally fleeing for his life, and he's probably at the lowest point ever in his life when he realizes his own son wants to kill him. He's humiliated, he's been driven from home, and he's under deadly enemy attack. Absalom and his troops are headed to Mahanaim. So that's our scene. Now, David needs a dose of encouragement. Do you agree? Yes, he's in a desperate situation. He wrote in Psalm 86, he said, give me a sign of your goodness, that my enemies will see it and be put to shame. For you, Lord, have helped me, and you're the one that comforts me. So God is going to lay on the heart of these 3 men to be that source of encouragement for him, a sign of God's goodness. So Shobi and Machir and Barzillai risk their lives. Last week we saw Hushai risk his life, and he was an undercover agent back in Absalom's palace. This week we have 3 men that are willing to risk their lives because they're going to help their king. They're going to present gifts to him, and they're going to encourage him. In Hebrews 3, we are admonished, exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. We are to look around. There are needs all around us, within our church body, within our community. There are needs all around us, and God lays on our hearts how he wants us to respond to those needs. And if we're carefully listening, he prompts us, does he not? And then our obedience is to do what he prompts us to do, to be the encourager or to meet the needs of people. So I want to look at these three men that God brings together, and here's one thing I want you to notice. Totally different backgrounds. But God uses three men totally different to meet the same need. So can God use all of us no matter where we have come from, no matter our status in society? And that's what we're going to see. First one we're going to look at is Shobi. And Shobi's name means glorious one. I imagine when he was coming with his supplies, he looked glorious to David and his people. Now, he's the son of Nahash. And Nahash means what? Serpent. This is his father. This is the home he's been raised in. We go back to 1 Samuel and we can learn about Nahash. It says Nahash the Ammonite, so is he an enemy? He's a Gentile. He came up and he encamped against the Israelites that were at Jabesh Gilead. And he tells them, I want you that live here in this area to serve me. This is Nahash speaking. And so the arrow shows you the location of this on the east side of the Jordan River. We're in the land of the Ammonites, which are enemies of Israel. So all the men of Jabesh, here are the Israelite people. And all the men of Jabesh say, okay, just make a covenant with us and we will serve you. He says, okay, here's my covenant. He spits venom all over him. And he says, I will make a covenant with you on this condition. I'm going to gouge out the right eye of every one of you and make you a reproach on Israel. Nice guy, huh? His son is Shobi, that God picks out to use to meet the need of the king. So they're the descendants of, these are the Ammonites, and they are the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. That's where Shobi comes from. And his father is the serpent spitting venom and going to gouge out the eyes of the Israelites. This is a terrible background for one of God's ministers to come from. True? Can God take people that have terrible backgrounds and use them? Absolutely. So we see, when we look at these three men, we're going to see God's grace using different people with their different gifts, their different backgrounds and upbringing to meet the needs of the king. So Shobi is chosen to be one of God's ministers or one of God's angels to David. God will pluck his servant from all backgrounds. He had, I'm sure, what must have been not a very good upbringing, living in the house with Nahash. He was the son of a very cruel man, but God transformed him to be a true friend of King David. God's grace all over Shobi. Now, another couple that came to my mind, we go to the court of Ahab and Jezebel. Was this not some of the most wicked time of Israel when they were under these two? This is in the northern kingdom. And there was a guy that worked in the court for them, and his name was Obadiah, not the one that wrote the book. Okay, he's in charge of the palace, so you see who his bosses are, Ahab and Jezebel. What's Jezebel doing? She is out killing all of God's prophets that she can get her hands on. What does Obadiah do? Even though those are his bosses, he takes 100 of God's prophets and he puts 50 in this cave and 50 in this cave, and he feeds them and takes care of them. So he feared the Lord greatly, and what do we see? God's grace again. He raised up a man that is in the wicked house of Ahab and Jezebel, laid on his heart to go feed and care for his prophets and hide them. because Jezebel's killing as many as she can find. There is a truth of Proverbs 16, verse 7, and it says, when a man's ways please the Lord, like Obadiah, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. Think of Daniel. Where is Daniel as a young man? He's in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. And remember, it was demanded that he eat the king's food, and he didn't want to. He says, God brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. Otherwise, Daniel might have been slain for refusing to eat the king's meat. Remember, that all worked out. Make even your enemies to be at peace with you. Now, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on Makir because I want to focus on the third one. Makir's name means bartered or sold, and his father was Amiel, and his father's name means my kinsman is God. Wow, that sounds like a great home to be raised in, doesn't it? Very different from Shobi. Oh, but they live in Lodabar. There, they didn't have hardly anything. Very poor because they lived in Lodabar. Lodabar was a town of forgotten people. It was the outcast. It was the very lonely people, the kind of the misfits, the handicapped. And that's who lived in Lodabar, and that's where Makir was from. It was said, Lodabar means it's a land of no pasture. They have no provision, but he is going to go give to the king out of his poverty. One is going to give out of his abundance. One gives out of his bad background. So we have God using all kinds of people. If you see my map, the blue arrow at the very top is the location of Lodabar. And if you follow the green arrow down to Mahanaim, that's the journey that Makir made to go put his contribution in to take to King David and his men. This is the man that cared for Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth lived, he was the crippled son, remember, of Jonathan. And David said, he asked about him, he said, where is Mephibosheth? And they said, he's been cared for in the house of Makir. And so this is the man that was taking care of Mephibosheth in the town of Lodabar when no one else seemed to care about Mephibosheth. The ones that nobody really seems to care about, that heart of compassion to reach out and help those people. Made me think of the lady that they rebuked in the New Testament, and Jesus said, leave her alone. She has done what she could, and she has anointed my body for burial beforehand. And then in 1 Corinthians 16, what does Paul tell us? He says, I beseech you, he says, the house of Stephanas that was the first fruits of Achaia. And listen to what he says. King James says, they have addicted themselves to the ministry of the saints. That's Makir. Addicted himself to minister to God's people wherever God would use him. Now, the last one is Barzillai. And so I want to focus on him for just a little bit. I think some of us will identify with him in that he is older. And he's going to finish well. And so what is my passion all the time? That we finish well and we don't stop as long as we have breath. Barzillai, his name means iron-hearted. So we have three totally different angels that God is using. These are men who will stand strong for the man of God, for David. They do not ever fear what the enemy can do. They stand up for the man of God anyway. Now, if you look at my map for a minute, the blue arrow at the top is Lodabar, and that's where Makir's from. The green arrow is Rogelim, and that's where Barzillai is from. And then the orange arrow at the bottom is where Shobi is from. The yellow star in the center, that's where they all three come together, and that's where David's camped. So you can see all three of them have had to come some distance bearing all this stuff to bring to King David. Now, I want to look at some of the virtues of Barzillai that are pointed out to us in Scripture. He's courageous, and he's very loyal. Was David in desperate need of support and provisions for all the people that were with him? Yes, they had very little with them. Barzillai, we're told, personally brings all these supplies to the king. And it says he's got hungry, thirsty followers. I see a need, what do? I do what I can to meet the need for whatever God lays on my heart. It says apparently he didn't consider the consequences of his actions. What would have happened to him, do you think, if Absalom had been successful and killed David and retained the throne? Barzillai, I'm sure, would have been killed, and all of those that were helping King David. But he didn't consider that. I found a quote that says, to Barzillai, David was still godly, although he was a fugitive. His great loving heart bled for the king as like a poor panting beast. He was hiding from his pursuers. David's hiding, he's on the run. Now, the quote goes on to say, bountifully, Barzillai provided David with necessary sustenance as he lay at Mahanaim. Now, we see Barzillai had a very wide influence. He wasn't, all the wealth that he had, we're going to be told in a later scripture, he was a man of great wealth. We have a very poor, and then we also had one that had a terrible background, and now we have a very wealthy man. He didn't squander his wealth on his idle pleasures. He didn't squander his wealth or hoard it for selfish ends. He gave out of his abundance. And it goes on to say he had position in his community, he had prestige, and he had a fat wallet. But he used it beneficially for others and to meet needs of God's people. Now, his loyalty continues even after this incident is over, because if we read on in 2 Samuel, we're going past the rebellion now, okay? There's been a war. We know Absalom is killed. David is now going to go back and take the throne in Jerusalem. Barzillai is still in the scene as we come to the next part of it. We don't hear of Shobi and Maker again, but Barzillai is still there. And so when David gets ready to return to Jerusalem, he's returning to Jerusalem to take back his throne. And it says he comes to the Jordan River. And then he's going to go across the Jordan River. He'll be at Gilgal. And then they will have an escort and take him on back to Jerusalem. And they have a ferry boat to get across the Jordan River. Now, here's Barzillai. Barzillai, the Gileadite, came down from Rogelim. This is about a 70-mile trip. And you think about the way they traveled. So he is going to come again. He's been home, and it says he's from Rogelim now. He's come down about 70 miles to be with King David to go over the Jordan to conduct the king over the Jordan River. Now, you think, well, okay, he's going to go 70 miles and see the king back over the Jordan River. And so we see the distance here. He had evidently gone back home because it tells us specifically again, he comes down from Rogelim to go to the Jordan River. So he's got this 70-mile journey again. And then the Bible tells you he's a very aged man. He's 80 years old, making this journey again to go down to see the king, go back across the Jordan River to take his throne back. It says he had provided the king with supplies while he stayed at Mahanaim, for he was a very rich man. It says, the Bible says, King James says he was a great man in his possessions. Now listen to what King David says to Barzillai. He says, come with me, come over the Jordan River with me. I will feed thee with me in Jerusalem. He invites Barzillai at 80 years old because of his kindness. I want to take you back and take care of you in the palace with me. And Barzillai says, how long do you think I have to live, that I should go up with the king unto Jerusalem? And he says, now some of us might identify with some of his old age infirmities. He says, it's getting harder for me to discern good and evil. He says, can I even taste what I eat or drink anymore? And he says, and I don't hear the voice of singing men and singing women anymore. So we see that the effects of old age are really beginning to set in on Barzillai. He says, I am thy servant. I only want to serve you. I don't want to be a burden to you. And he says, thy servant, I'll go a little way over the Jordan with the king, but you don't need to pay me for that. You don't need to reward me just because I am here to go over the Jordan with you. Barzillai felt his services were trivial and just unworthy of any recompense. You don't need to pay me for that. I'm your servant. Does he not show us the beauty of old age and a relationship with the king? He says, although he's not spared the infirmities of old age, he retained his charm. 80 years of his heart of love was deep and broad for his king. Now, old John Trapp, I don't know who it is, but I found this quote. He says, Barzillai had lost his color, but he kept his sweet savor with the rose. So he tells us really, and I just thought, wow, that I would have that grace to grow old beautifully. You know, I think we all want to do that, because some people, when they get older, are a little bit harder to deal with. And I don't want to be that way. It's still that heart of love and so forth. So I hope that God grants us each the grace to grow old beautifully. And so here's what he says to King David. He says, let thy servant, I pray thee. I want to turn back again. I want to go back home. And he says, I want to be buried by my father and my mother. He says, but look, here's Chimham. And we find out later that's his son. He said, here's Chimham. I want him to go with you. Can he go in my place? And you do to him what will seem good unto you. Now, here's a guy that's anticipating his death. But one quote I found said he's not afraid to face the crossing of the bar. He's ready to go. Barzillai, having shown us how to live, he also shows us how to die. He dies the same devout, noble, magnanimous man that he has lived all of his days. If ours is grace to live well, grace will be given to die well. Now, even in his final moments with David, Barzillai sought the welfare of others. He wants a better life for his son, Chimham. Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do to him that which shall seem good unto thee. And whatsoever thou shalt require of me, that will I do for thee. And then in 2 Samuel 19:39 it says, all the people now are going to cross the Jordan that had been with David. When the king was come over, the king kissed Barzillai, he blessed him, and then Barzillai went back home to his own place. Barzillai shows us he maintained an attitude of service and self-sacrifice to God and to his fellow man. He took advantage of all the opportunities that God gave him to be used by God in the lives of others, even in his old age. I don't want to ever hear any of you say, God can't use me. He uses every one of us as long as we have breath. There's something that he's going to lay on your heart and a way to use you to minister to other people. He saw needs, and he proceeded to meet the needs. And you say, well, I don't have the wealth. Neither did Shobi. Neither did Maker. But they gave what they could. Now, the deeds of kindness were done out of love, and he did not expect any recompense. He truly did it out of a heart of love, service. He said, I'm your servant, out of a heart of gratitude. He offers us a powerful example of the legacy one person can have through loving God and serving others, even during very difficult times. God seems to allow special honor to be offered to those who give out of their abundance, as well as those who will give sacrificially. You remember the widow's mite, and she gave all. Now, then the king went on to Gilgal, and who went with him? Chimham. This is Barzillai's son. And so the king takes his son and takes him back to the palace with him. And then if we jump to 1 Kings 2:7, we see David is about to die, and he is transferring the kingdom over to Solomon, his son. And look at his words. Show kindness to the sons, plural, of Barzillai the Gileadite. Let them be among those who come and eat at your table, for they came to me when I fled from Absalom your brother. Wow, can you imagine that King David still remembers him, and he bestows that blessing on his descendants to Solomon. And then this is very curious. If those of you that like to dig, here's something for you to dig on, and you can report to me what you find, because I haven't done the digging on it. Jeremiah 41:17 talks about some people are departing, and it says they dwelled in the habitation of who? Chimham, which is by Bethlehem, on their way to go to Egypt. Now, some of the commentators say, did King David, where was David born? Bethlehem? Did King David leave something to Chimham in the area of Bethlehem, and it became his habitation, and when people were traveling, they stayed in it? I don't know. I mean, it makes sense to me, but I didn't have time to really research it. But that's a verse, very interesting. We see Chimham again, and he has a place for people to stay in Bethlehem. And David was from Bethlehem. And he remembered Barzillai and his sons. Now, Barzillai's kindness was remembered even after his death, and he is mentioned by King David. And King David has blessing on the sons of Barzillai. He modeled true service. All of these servants you and I have looked at over the last 3 weeks, true service, offering to do for King David whatever needed to be done in his life. Now, do you remember Ittai? He was our first one. He met David right as David is leaving Jerusalem. Remember, he's leaving Jerusalem. They've said Absalom has declared that he is coming and he's the king. He was in Hebron and he's coming up to take over. What did David do? He leaves humiliated, barefooted. He says, I'm not going to force you to be the king. And as they're going out of the gate to Jerusalem to go to the Kidron Valley, he points out one person and calls him by name, and it was Ittai. And he said, you're going with us? He said, you should go back. Why? You just came here 24 hours ago. Y'all remember that? That was lesson number 2. And he finds when David needed it, Ittai, God put him in David's life to show companion that was loyal and faithful to the king. Now, you remember last week? Last week we had David ascending the Mount of Olives, which is over there. Remember, if we have our geography, it's out east. And so David is ascending the Mount of Olives, and what does somebody whisper in his ear? Ahithophel, your trusted counselor and friend, he has defected and he's on the side of Absalom now. And what did David do? He lifted his eyes and he said, oh God, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And he looks and he says, there's Hushai. There's God's answer to my prayer. Hushai had also been his counselor and advisor. And remember, he asked Hushai, risk your life. You're going to go back to Jerusalem, and you're going to go to the king's palace, and you're going to be the ears in there for me. And then I have Zadok and I have Abiathar. You're going to relay the message to them. Then you're going to get the message to their 2 boys, so King David will know what's going on. So we had 5 people involved in that undercover spy story last week. Hushai met David, and he risked his life in the presence of his enemies. And now we're traveled up to Mahanaim, and the war is about to break out. And God sends 3 angels to minister to David here: Shobi, Maker, and Barzillai. All these men that he had put in the life of King David were called sheltering trees. Have you had a sheltering tree in your life before? I have. Boy, when we found out what Laura was going to do, I had a couple of couples in this church that took Paul and me under their wing and nurtured us because we were devastated. We were in a desperate state. And we had people that came along beside us and just loved on us and took care of us while we knew what she was doing. When she was in San Francisco, flown out there to have a double mastectomy as an outpatient, God sent sheltering trees in our lives. And he does that for each of us. Friends in our lives who will lift us up before the King of Kings. So you and I, may each one of us press on towards that prize so we will hear, well done, good and faithful servant. Whatever he lays on your heart to do, ask him to put promptings in your heart of things he wants you to do. And he will continue to give them if you're obedient to respond to him. Now, I don't do this very often, but I am shifting gears, and we're going to study something a little bit different. So I want you to really focus here because this is going to be a wow before I'm over. I did not realize this, and when I found it, I thought I'm going to include it this week. So I want you to focus on the map up here. I hope you can see it well. Yeah, pretty well. And I want you to see Jerusalem has 3 main valleys, okay? And those of you that have been here the last few weeks, where are you and I? We're in the Kidron Valley. So if you look at the map, the Kidron Valley is the furthest yellow line over on the right side. Do you see it? Furthest east. So we have the Mount of Olives up here. If you look at the topography of Jerusalem, you have the Mount of Olives over here, you come down and we're in the Kidron Valley. And then when we look up out here west, we can see the Temple Mount, remember? And so the Temple Mount is up here right outside to the west over here. And then if you keep going west, you're going to come down to another valley, and that's called the Central Valley. And then you're going to come to Mount Zion, way out west, and then you're going to have another valley called the Hinnom Valley. So can you get the picture? It's like Mount, Valley, Mount, Valley, Mount, Valley. So you can kind of get the idea of the layout of Jerusalem. Do you see the 3 valleys? Okay, they're in yellow. Do you see my 3 orange buttons? Those are the mounts. The one on the far right is the Mount of Olives. The one in the middle is Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount, and then the one on the far left to the west is Mount Zion. So everybody kind of had that in their mind, and just keep this in your mind. We're like this. Okay, we are going to look at the Gehenna or the Hinnom Valley. Now, if I am standing here in the Kidron, where is the Hinnom Valley? Furthest west, okay? So now we're looking way out west, and we have the Temple Mount, we have a valley, then we have Mount Zion, and it's that far valley. Okay, y'all with me? Okay, that valley is west, and it comes all the way around, and it makes a loop, and it comes south. So it will be somewhere out here south where it ends, okay? That's the valley I'm talking about first, is the Hinnom Valley. Okay. This was also the tribal border between, they had land allotments. Okay. The Hinnom Valley separated the tribe of Judah to the south and the tribe of Benjamin to the north. So those are the 2 land allotments that were working, the 2 tribes. Did you know that Jerusalem, most people think it's in the land allotment of Judah? It's in the land allotment of Benjamin. Okay, that's another lesson. Okay, so this is where we are. Now, here's a person that took a picture. He's standing on the Mount of Olives over here, and he is facing this direction, and see the white line? He's taking a picture, and that's the view looking out across Jerusalem today towards the Hinnom Valley. Okay, everybody pretty well with me? Okay, we're in the Hinnom Valley. We're the far west valley that loops around and comes south. Now, in this valley, it was a very sad place. They had what were called Tophets. These were fire stoves, and they were in the valley outside the gate and the walls of Jerusalem. And in 2 Kings 23:10 it says, these topheths, are these fire stoves, were in a high place in the valley of Hinnom, just south of Jerusalem, and this is where the Israelites themselves, like pagans, threw their babies and their children into the fire alive to the pagan god Molech. Now that's what was going on right out there. If we're in the Kidron Valley, it's right out there somewhere. Okay. Now, in Jeremiah 7, it talks about the vile abomination to God. In verse 31, it says they built high places. You know what high places were. That's where they would build the altars and then do the rituals and stuff like the pagans. They built these high places of Tophet in the valley of the son of Hinnom to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire. And God says, I did not command them to do that. He said, it never even entered my heart that they would do that. Now, it was a place of tremendous evil. This is an artist rendition. Remember, Molech had the head of a bull. And so you see where the abdomen would be, and this was the open pit. And the children of Israel, God's people, when they were affected by the pagans, they would throw their children, they'd give them to the priest, throw their babies and their children into that fire to offer them, to appease the god Molech. Now, the Tophet, it can mean drum or to burn. And here's what was happening. As they would throw their children in there, or they were thrown in by the priest usually, can you imagine the shrieking and the screaming of the children that was going on? So while they're doing the sacrifice, what were they also doing? They had drums beating louder and louder. Why? Because they didn't want to hear. They didn't want to hear the cries of the children. So Tophet means drum or to burn. Now, here is one of the grave markers that they found. And it says these grave markers were set up over burial urns containing the cremated bodies of the babies, small children, and even animals that were sacrificed. God says, I never commanded it. It didn't even enter my heart. Now, when King Josiah came along, remember, he was one of the, I think, 4 good kings of the southern kingdom. And when he came along, he tore down the high places and he ended the child sacrifice. So it ended at that time. Now, in later years, this valley is going to be used for incinerating. Now they're going to start burning the bodies of all the criminals and the bodies of all the unclean animals. And this valley right out here is going to be a place, it's going to become like the garbage dump of the city. So you have all of this is going to be burned, just going on all the time. And it is said that a fire was kept constantly burning. And this is just outside our walls and gates out here in this valley. So there's a place of burning sewage going on. There's a place of burning flesh and all the garbage. Can you imagine the dark, dreary place that this valley is? Now, can you imagine maggots, worms crawling through all the waste, all the decayed skeletons of people and of animals? Can you imagine the sickening smoke? You have burning flesh. I won't get any more graphic, but it is a reality. Now, this Hinnom Valley will later be called the Gehenna Valley. It is a place that's utterly filthy, it is disgusting, and it is repulsive to the nose and to the eyes, and we can kind of imagine that. Now, for those of you that went through 2014 with me when we did the walls and gates of Jerusalem with Nehemiah, this is where the Dung Gate was located. So that all makes sense. The Dung Gate, where we found out we have to stay there because of all the uncleanness in our life, and we're constantly offering ourselves as a living sacrifice to the Lord. We're to keep our vessel clean, etc. So This is where the dung gate was located in that valley, and they'd be burning the trash, etc. Now, from these practices, when it gets into the New Testament, the Greek form is Gehinnom, or Gehenna, and it came to be used as a synonym for hell. So you can see we've kind of described it, what's going on out in the valley. Gehenna is actually translated hell in the King James Version in Matthew 4, verse 22, and in verse 29. You can read those when you go back through the lesson. Now, by the time Jesus Christ is on the earth and he's walking among them in his 3 years of ministry, you have this deep, constantly burning valley of Hinnom, was also known as the Valley of Gehenna, and they even began to refer to it as hell, and they knew what they meant by it. It took on a popular image like the place down there to the people, where the wicked would eventually be cast into the flames for destruction. Jesus even used it as a symbolic picture of hell in his ministry. It was a place of eternal torment. Now think about what I described to you. Constant uncleanness, the fire never ceases burning, and where the worm dies not, because the worms never stopped crawling. Gehenna became associated with eternal torment because of those detestable sacrifices that had been made to Molech. So kind of a little summary here about the Hinnom, or Gehenna Valley. That's where the Tophets were. It was an actual physical place during the time of Jesus Christ at the edge of ancient Jerusalem. It was a place where they had idolatry, all kinds of pagan practices, and then it became a place where they put all the criminals, and they put the unclean animals and all the trash, and they burned it. Continuous fires burning to control the odor. Now, we're going to leave that valley. I know y'all are glad. We're going to go over Mount Moriah, and now we have another valley called the Central, or the Tyropoeon Valley. This separates Mount Moriah from Mount Zion. And as we get into this valley, I'm just going to stay here about 2 seconds. The Central and the Hinnom join the Kidron. Do you see my orange arrow at the bottom? Because the Western comes around to the south, and then you have the Central, and then the Kidron is over here. They kind of come together down south. So we have these valleys joining one another. The Central Valley was the main street during the time of Jesus when he walked on the earth. And they had shops, and the markets were down in the valley, and then they had bridges above during that time. Now, we're going to go on to the Kidron Valley, and we have spent lots of time there the last few weeks, so I'm not going to dwell here. The Kidron Valley, here we are, it separates the Mount of Olives from the Temple Mount, or Mount Moriah. So this is down in the Kidron Valley. The valley means shadow, shady, or dark. They think it was about 50 feet deeper hundreds of years ago. Because remember, when they would come clean the temple, what did they do? They threw all the pagan idols and they crushed them, and they were burying all this stuff, and it built up. And so they think it used to be about 50 feet deeper. This also has Jerusalem's only water source. Remember, they're not by any kind of a river or spring or anything like that, except they found the Gihon Spring. That is the only water source. It is in the Kidron Valley on the east side of Jerusalem. You remember Hezekiah's tunnel and the Warren shaft? You'd have to go back and study all that. That's how they got the water, and they piped it all the way down to the pool of Siloam inside of Jerusalem, so that when they were under attack, their water came from the Gihon Springs, which was outside the wall, but they piped it and brought it into the pool of Siloam inside the wall, so they would have water during attack. Now, during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is in the fall, they had 4 enormous oil lamps that would be burning in the temple courtyard. Each lamp had 4 large bowls of oil on these tall stands. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. Now, they had wicks. Now, if you remember our lesson about 2 years ago, they took the worn out priestly garments when they were worn out, and they would braid the little shreds together, and that's what they made the wicks with, the ones that the priest had made. Oh, here's a picture. Can you see the yellow arrows? It's hard to see, but they're pointing to the wicks that were in the little bowls of oil. And the wicks they were the worn out garments of the priest. Now, during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is for about a week in the fall, they had these large menorahs that were 50 cubits tall. That's about 73 feet. And they illuminated the temple court. And the Feast of Tabernacles provided the setting when Jesus would proclaim, "I am the light of the world." Now, here's an artist rendition of the temple. And where is the Temple Mount from where we are in the Kidron Valley? Right up there. Remember, it's a steep ascent. So it's way up there. And do you see the little guy on the ladder? He's in yellow. I have a yellow arrow. They had ladders, and these things are 73 feet high. They had to climb up them, and they would keep putting oil in so the light would not go out. All right? And there's 4 of those in the temple courtyard, and you can see they each have 4 bowls on them. All right? You have that picture in your mind? So at night, it would light up the temple courtyard for the Feast of Tabernacles only. Okay? Everybody have this in mind? Okay. Now, there's a quote that says, "There was not a courtyard in Jerusalem that did not reflect the light." The light could be seen all over Jerusalem, except where? In the Kidron Valley. Because of the steep angle and so forth, the light didn't shine down here in this deep valley. It remained in the shadows, and there many dead people had been cast out here during the years. This was then came to be known, we are in the valley of the shadow of death. This is that Kidron Valley. Now, can you see David walking through it? Can you see Jesus Christ walking through this Kidron Valley? It was called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. And some of our translations say it's a valley of deep darkness. Have you been in a deep, dark trial? This valley of a deep darkness. Now, they think David wrote Psalm 23 at some point when he was fleeing from Absalom. I want to go through it, and now that you have all of this knowledge, the Psalm 23 is going to jump off the page at you. They believe David wrote this later in life. He's dealing with some of the difficult things he experienced during his long walk with the Lord. This message is for mature Christians. Psalm 23, people who have fought many battles and carried burdens during all of their spiritual growth. There's a fullness of experience about Psalm 23, but yet there's a tone of subdued, quiet confidence, which speaks of a heart that's mellowed. Do most of you feel like you have mellowed? I know my family's glad I have. Heart mellowed by years and of a faith that's now mature because of all the trials that it's been through. They call it the valley of death or the valley of deep darkness. Listen to the words now and think about David and Jesus Christ. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters, and he restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Now picture David right now. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, these deep, dark trials, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Now, when I saw this, think about David with those 3 angels we just talked about. "You have prepared me a table before the presence of my enemies." Can you see how God sent things to minister to David, prepared him this feast? They even brought not only necessities, they brought some luxuries. the cheese and the sheep, the different things they brought. You've prepared a table before me, right in the presence of mine enemies. You have anointed my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. They felt safe and secure because of the way Jerusalem was laid out, with the mountains and the valleys and the peaks and the valleys. They felt very secure. Titus, who defeated them in 70 AD, burned the temple and defeated the nation of the Jews. Here's his quote: "If it had not been for the internal dissensions among the people, the city could have never been taken. It was considered impregnable because of the topography of the land." Now, are y'all ready? I had never seen this. In 1 Kings 8, verse 28 and 29, Solomon is at the dedication of the temple, and this is his prayer. And he's quoting God, Jehovah God, and he says, "My name shall be in the land." Did God choose Jerusalem for his city? Yes, he says that it is eternal, and it will be his city. It will be the capital of the world during the millennial reign. And God says, "My name will be in the land." The Hebrew letter, the 21st letter of the Hebrew letter alphabet is Sheen, and it is in the shape of loosely in the shape of a W. It represents God's name, El Shaddai, God Almighty. It represents the all-sufficient one, and it represents El Shaddai, the keeper of the doors of Israel. Now, with satellite imagery that they have been able to look from a helicopter view, I want you to look at the letter that's formed because of the mountain peaks, and look at the valleys. They're in blue. Can you see the shape of the letter W? God said, "I'm going to put my name on my city." My name on my city. And when you look at this, it's the paleo W, which is the pictorial, but it makes like the letter W on the city of Jerusalem itself, if you look at the valleys. In the upper left corner, you can see what the modern Sheen letter looks like. And in the bottom right corner is the paleo version. And the valleys, if you just outline the valleys, it looks very much like that. And then in 1 Kings 11:36 it says, "Yet to his son I will give one tribe." Remember, the kingdom was going to be divided. "That David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem." Look at the last part of the verse. "The city where I have chosen to put my name." They showed this to some rabbis. And when the rabbis saw it, they said, "Our city sits on top of the name of God." Isn't that an awesome thing? I mean, our God is beyond anything we can even imagine. All these little details. And he has his city built, and the valleys around it form his name, El Shaddai. Now, it's his name, it's his land, and he is still on guard for Jerusalem. You and I are admonished to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. He is still the keeper, and he neither slumbers nor sleeps for Israel. Let's pray. Father, we continue to be amazed at your word. When we dig and we surrender to the Holy Spirit and ask him to teach us and show us things, God, the word is just such an endless treasure chest. All these nuggets that we find week after week that you show us. Oh God, it just thrills our hearts. Your word is such a treasure. May we realize its power. May we realize our desperate need of it in our life. And may we feed on it daily. And Lord, I pray that you'll give us an insatiable hunger for your word that cannot be satisfied. We thank you and praise you for your word and for the plan of salvation, for your love for us. And I pray that you'll bless our going out now. And Lord, lay on our hearts the ways you want us to minister to those in need this week, to show your love. In Christ's name, amen.